Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Hello, my name is Kat. I am working in the education department at the Tenement Museum. I'm really glad that you all have joined for the launch of our latest tour, Reclaiming Black Spaces. I'm really glad to be with you all here virtually tonight. Just a couple of things to know as we're getting started. We really want to hear from you throughout the tour, so please use the chat to communicate any questions, any connections that you're making as we move through the stories tonight. And my colleague will be passing those questions and comments along to me. So we really hope for this to be a conversation. So tonight's tour is really an exciting moment for the Tenement Museum. This is the moment where, for really the first time in 20 years, we are incorporating stories of Black and African American experiences into the stories of the Tenement Museum. So our tour tonight is a virtual version of what will be an in-person walking tour that we will launch in the middle of June. And this tour, we see here a map of the stops that we'll explore tonight. So we'll get to hear 5 different stories of Black and African American experiences really throughout Lower Manhattan. And this tour, as all of the Tenement Museum's tours do, begins with our tenement buildings. These 2 buildings, if you're not familiar, are 97 and 103 Orchard Street. These are both on the same block of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And most of our tours, they really start with the stories of people who lived in these 2 buildings. This tour is a little different in that what we're starting with, where this tour emerges from, is actually through looking at who didn't live in these 2 buildings. In 1988, when the Tenement Museum was founded, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, our founders, they really did think that African American history would be part of the work of the Tenement Museum. They didn't want the Tenement Museum to be frozen in any one moment in time or to only represent one particular group of people. And so they thought that they would be able to tell the stories of a Black or African American family who lived in 97 Orchard Street, where the museum began. However, as they looked at census records and birth certificates, marriage certificates, began to do research into the people who had called this building home, no people of African descent were found on any of those records. So for the last 33 years, we've told stories of people who lived in these tenements, told the stories of working class lives, the stories of immigrants and migrants who lived in the Lower East Side. And throughout these stories, and maybe many of you have had this same experience, we've heard from visitors. How do we understand how Black communities are connected to the stories that we tell? Where were the Black communities in the city in these different periods that the Tenement Museum explores? And 97 Orchard Street, it was open as a home from 1863 to 1935. In this period, we know no one of African descent lived in 97 Orchard Street, but really much more broadly, looking at the neighborhood that we know as the Lower East Side today, from 1863 to 1935, there were really very few, people of African descent in the neighborhood in this period. So, for the museum, when we were asked these questions, our answer was often, there were no Black people who lived in this building. And, this answer is no longer sufficient. We've known that this answer has not been sufficient for some time. And this is really the work ahead for the museum, embarking on researching and connecting the stories of Black and African American experiences to the stories of the immigrants and migrants that we've been talking about in our 33-year history. And doing this work of learning sort of where were Black communities, how are the stories of Black and African Americans connected to our stories. This work involves us doing things a little bit differently. And involves multiple different projects. So we will, within the next year and a half, open up a building tour that explores the story of an African-American couple who lived not in 97 Orchard Street, but a little bit west of the building, so that we can understand, okay, if no one of African descent lived in 97 Orchard Street in the 19th century, where were those Black communities? How can we better connect these stories through a building exhibit? So we have that work ahead of us. And then we, of course, have our tour this evening, where we embarked on research that explored, not only Black and African-American experiences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in land that we now know as the Lower East Side, but really looked at both a broader geography and a broader timeline to help fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge and to have a deeper understanding of the land that we now know as the Lower East Side and who has impacted this land over centuries that can then inform the stories that we already tell. So our tour tonight, it will take us into slightly different geography than what's known as the Lower East Side today. So here, we see a map of Manhattan, so from the southern tip to South Harlem. Maybe many of you associate, Black history in New York City with Harlem primarily. Our tour really focuses in Lower Manhattan and, a more broad sense of Lower Manhattan than the Lower East Side. So this Black star, we can scroll in a little bit to see, this is where the Tenement Museum stands today. And this gray rectangle is where we will be sort of exploring through the sites on this tour. So each of these stories in tonight's tour represents a moment in time, a example, a story of Black communities shaping space for themselves in Lower Manhattan. And it's helpful to think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts of just what associations do you have with Lower Manhattan? What comes to mind when you think of this geography? So let us know in the chat sort of what comes to mind when you're thinking about this area of the city. Each of these stories will explore a different period in time, and we'll see the evolution of how we understand space and geography of Black communities. We'll explore how language changes over time, how people of African descent were, naming themselves, how they were being named by, the white dominant society. And, it's a helpful moment to just address language and identity. You've heard me use the word Black to describe people of African descent so far in this introduction. And, it's important to recognize that the people that we'll talk about tonight, they might not have used that word to describe themselves, depending on the period in which they lived, how they were thinking about their own experiences. So we'll sort of see how language evolves. We've made the decision to use the word Black and to capitalize this word to really, use the most inclusive current term for, just the wide range of identities and experiences of people of African descent. We'll be curious to hear your thoughts on language as we move through the tour. It's important to note as well, that I'm sharing these stories with you as a white person, and that there are limitations to the way that I can understand these experiences because of my own lived experience. So this is where we're really in this tour together. I, want to hear your experiences. Please share from your own perspective as we're moving through these stories. There's probably history that many of you have lived through that we'll talk about tonight. I really want you to know that we're in this together. So we want to hear sort of how you're connecting to these stories as we are moving through. And, this sense that we're in this together, the Tenement Museum, we very much know that we are not, quote unquote, reclaiming these spaces or these stories alone within the Lower Manhattan landscape. For generations, people of African descent have been fighting against the erasure of their stories from the landscape of the city, from the larger historical narratives. And so we're doing this work alongside, generations of people who have been doing this work, and also, people within the city today, community organizations, cultural institutions, historic sites who are working to unearth and unerase the stories of Black history from our landscape. So I see just a few responses coming in to just how you think about Lower Manhattan, and the way that this land of the city can bring up so many different associations, right? Of wealth, of migration or immigration, of the financial district. And of course, this is where the city begins in the colonial period. And so that's where we're going to start. In the 1640s, going back nearly 400 years to look at who were the first Black communities in the land that we now know as the Lower East Side, and what were their lives like within the colony of New Amsterdam. So this is where we will begin our journey, and we're actually going to start with even further back in the period before European colonization. So what you're looking at here is a photo illustration. It's meant to depict the year 1609. And you see in the central left part of the image, that's the tip of today's Manhattan. So you can peel back all of those layers of skyscrapers and the busy streets of the city from your memory of this land, and sort of step into these lush forests. There would be pine and oak tree forests. The Lenape call this land Mannahatta, which means the island of many hills. So this land is very, very hilly. And this is on the wider Lenape land of Lenape-Hoking. And we can see actually the smoke sort of indicating where Lenape settlements might be on this land in this period before colonization. And so, when we're talking about Black communities in, this geography, we really have to begin with the very first non-Indigenous settler. In the year 1613, a man named Juan Rodriguez arrives with a Dutch merchant to, Mannahatta. And the Dutch merchant leaves. Juan Rodriguez stays. He's of African and Portuguese descent. He was from the island of Saint-Domingue, today's the land where we have the country of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he marries into the Lenape family and lives really as the first New Yorker in many ways. So it would be another 13 years from Juan Rodriguez's arrival before the Dutch colonize this land. And the Dutch arrival really brings, of course, immense, physical and social transformation to this land. Here we see a drawing. This is depicting 1626 to 28. And this is basically the exact same geography that we were just looking at from a slightly different perspective. What I'm circling here, you see the fort of the colony of New Amsterdam. This colony was established by the Dutch West India Company. So it's essentially a company town centered around business and trade. And this is the sort of southern tip of Mannahatta, where the Dutch set up this colony. So a couple of things to think about with this colony. Probably many of you are familiar, but this is a really small colony, very, very small population of New Amsterdam. And it's really, really diverse. There are Europeans, there's people from today's Middle East, from South America and the Caribbean. And there's also a population of people of African descent, many of whom are enslaved. The Dutch West India Company enslaves people of African descent and others to essentially build the physical structure of the colony. So if you remember that photo illustration we just looked at, these lush trees and forests, and then look at this image, we only see a few trees. All of these trees have been cleared. That would have been work done by enslaved laborers. These small houses that we see where people would have been living, these were probably built by people who were enslaved. This wall around the fort would have been built by people who were enslaved. So the people of African descent who are enslaved by the company, they're building up the physical infrastructure of the colony. And they are, in many ways, also the most stable part of the colony. Europeans are coming and going, as are people of other backgrounds, but the enslaved Africans here really don't have that option. So, this is an important moment to acknowledge how, forced migration can be seen as a kind of migration, right? The Tenement Museum, we're known for telling stories of immigration primarily. And this is really a moment for us to expand and look at stories more broadly of migration, whether that is by choice or by force, and how people are being forcibly brought here by the Dutch West India Company to build up the colony and then figure out how to live their lives within the limitations that they're finding. I mean, within slavery under the Dutch, it looks a little different than slavery would under the British. People who are enslaved have the right to sue in court, in Dutch court in the colony. They have the right to marry in the Dutch Reformed Church. So, sort of it's important to see how, this sort of system of slavery has particular texture, depending on the place that we're talking about, the time that we're talking about, but also important, of course, to acknowledge that slavery is slavery. And, we can see how people within the Dutch West India Company's colony of New Amsterdam, people who are enslaved are constantly trying to get out of enslavement and to resist against this status, that's limiting their lives. So, we see a big moment of this in the year 1644. A group of 11 people who were enslaved, they come together and they petition for their freedom. And, they were sort of seeing this very tactically. They had just served defending the colony against the Lenape in a war. And they knew that in some ways the Dutch West India Company needed them as, essentially a military force against the Lenape. So they take this moment after this war to petition for their freedom, and they receive it. These 11 people are issued freedom by the Dutch West India Company. However, it's not true freedom. It's what some historians have called half freedom, some have called conditional freedom. They, in this new status would have to pay an annual tax to the Dutch West India Company. They would have to go back to work for the company at any point, although for wages. So a little bit different than their work as enslaved laborers. But crucially to understanding this status, their children would continue to be enslaved. So this is where we really see the tensions and complications of this change in status. And this takes us to sort of the geography that changes with the petitioning for freedom. As part of this package, not only are these people issued freedom, but they receive plots of land that have a house and a garden from the Dutch West India Company, and essentially become landowners. And this is then where we can understand how this story connects to where the Tenement Museum is. This is a typed up version of a source from the Dutch West India Company's papers that is what was known as a land grant. Here it says a patent. It's to a man who here we see referred to as Sebastian Negro. We see other documents that refer to him as Sebastiaen de Britto. And this is issuing a certain piece of land located on the island of Manhattan. Its length along the public wagon road, which is today's Bowery, is 200 paces by 300 paces. So this land grant is issued to a man named Sebastian, and this land is right in the backyard of where the Tenement Museum stands today. And Bastian, he wasn't part of this first group of 11 who petitioned for his freedom, but he's not long after. It's 1647 when he receives this land. So just 3 years after this initial group, he is also petitioning for his freedom and receiving a house and garden plot just north of the city, the colony further south. So here's where we can see, just briefly, let me show you this to understand where these farms are located in relationship to the colony. So this is showing modern day Canal Street in the city. We see this shaded area for the farmland of people of African descent, like Bastian. And then we see the colony down south. So it's about a mile. And, of course, the wall of the colony was our modern day Wall Street. That's how Wall Street gets its name. So about a mile between the farmland and the colony. This is, again, on the part of the Dutch West India Company, a defense of issuing these farm plots north of the colony that they're trying to protect. But for people like Bastian, this is a chance to set up a home for himself, and you have land that is away from the colony. So if we scroll in here to this image, this is Bastian's plot of land, circled in purple. So you can see this not quite rectangle shape, and this is the land that Bastian would have to farm. And this circle right here, that's where the Tenement Museum is now. So, essentially right next to where 97 and 103 Orchard Street stand today, in 1647, this becomes Sebastiaen de Britto's home. And so, Bastian, he 6 months later marries a woman named Isabel Casena. I'm sorry, that's 6 months after he receives this land. So in October, he marries a woman named Isabel Casena, who's from Angola. And they live here together. So we can imagine, here we're looking at a map, but imagine a small house, probably some crops of some kind, maybe corn or wheat. Imagine maybe perhaps some fruit trees, some livestock, and Bastian and Isabel, living alongside other people of African descent, as well as others, more widely within these farm plots. There are both, white and Black, people who have these land grants. But Bastian's two northern neighbors, Anthony Congo and Francisco d'Angola, are people of African descent. And, we can start to imagine then, how well they would know each other, being neighbors, having probably lived in this small, society for some time together, and of course just being part of a small community overall within the wider colony of New Amsterdam, that people of African descent are forging community for themselves on this land that becomes eventually known as the land of the Blacks, because of all of the farms that are owned by people of African descent. So let's take a moment to look at some of those people and what we can know about, the Black landowners from this time period. So here we see this list. It's about 30 people. The Dutch West India Company issues in total between the early 1640s and the early 1660s, about 30 of these plots to different people of African descent. We see Bastian highlighted here with his 6 acres on March 26th. But I'd be curious, just what are you noticing perhaps about what we can learn of people's identities, the details of people's experiences perhaps that are coming out from looking at this list. So I'd be curious to hear, what you're noticing within this. But, we certainly see the one thing that's always jumping out to me is just the reference to geography, that we see people's last names listed as places: Angola, Congo, San Tome, right, an island off of Central West Africa, that we see that people's names reflect perhaps the place where they were enslaved in Africa, or places that they have moved through. We see reference to someone who has the name the Spaniard after his first name, or Cartagena in South America. So geography, of course, is represented here. And, I also always notice that there are women on this list, that there are Black women landowners in New Amsterdam, and that, we can see that people are receiving these land grants on the same date in many cases. And that just makes me think, perhaps these people are going together to petition for their land. Maybe they're, taking a moment to celebrate together after receiving the land. All of these people are going to know each other. And they're carrying with them, their whole life experiences and knowledge as people who have moved through not only African societies, but also European societies, that the Dutch were not as often enslaving people directly from Africa. So people are moving through places in the Caribbean, places in South America that were, part of the Dutch Empire in this period. Bastian himself, we see a reference to him being from Santo Domingo. Again, in this period, that was part of the wider island of San Domingue or Hispaniola, today's Haiti and Dominican Republic. So, there is a sort of forging of relationships across, identities and across experiences. And we even see that in Bastian's marriage to Isabel Cassana, that she's listed as from Angola on their marriage record. And, we don't know whether Bastian had ties to that geography as well, or if they're, forming a relationship across what perhaps could have been some divides. So I'm seeing a question, was it true that people came to the Northeast colonies were brought from the West Indies, not directly from Africa? It depends on the time period. A little bit later in the history of New Amsterdam, so by the late 1650s, early 1660s, it is much more common that the Dutch West India Company are enslaving people directly from Africa. And of course, when we get to the later colonial period of British colonization, that many more people are being enslaved directly from Africa. But keeping in mind too that even people who were enslaved from Africa also have a wealth of experiences and knowledge and lingual skills that they're bringing to their lives, in the colonial, era. So I also just want to address and take a moment, probably some of you have had questions about this, but you'll hear me use the word enslaved rather than slave. And, this is really kind of the emerging research from historians and sociologists that we have a chance through our language to kind of understand, the people who were experiencing this condition of enslavement by using the adjective of enslaved instead of the noun. So, I'm sure that this comes up for many of you, right? I'm sure some of you are teachers or, are familiar with this. So, we can see how our language can really shape the way that we understand people's experiences. And for someone like Bastian, right, that he has the status of conditional freedom, but we don't know how he would have thought about himself, right? And what he would have wanted for his life. So that, of course, is important to address too, that all of these records that we see for this period, they're through the white colonial perspective, from the European perspective. We don't have Bastian's voice within these stories. Although we do see some records from, a little bit later of these people leaving wills to their children, granting their land to the next generation. And that, really brings us to kind of the transition of this colony from New Amsterdam to what we know as New York. So the British, they, take over this colony in 1644. And, by that point, this farmland of people of African descent, it stretches all the way up to modern day 34th Street. And while initially the British sort of take a hands-off approach, allow people of African descent to keep this land, increasingly life will become more difficult for people of African descent in New York and under the British, and laws and restrictions will be placed in quick succession on Black lives. And so we see that by the beginning of the 18th century, that people of African descent are not allowed to own property, that this right is taken away, and that people, like Bastian and his cohort are finding that it is much more difficult for them to be able to make decisions about their own lives. So, this history has largely been erased from our landscape. And, it is important within our work today, as we move through the city to see, how legacies have been erased and how we can resurface them. So there's one place within the city where you can go to really connect to stories of people like Bastian and Isabel and commemorate this history. This is the African Burial Ground National Monument. And if you're not familiar with this, you should definitely go visit. It is at 290 Broadway, so further south from where the Tenement Museum is. And this is a memorial that was erected in the late 20th century to commemorate the lives of the people who were laid to rest on what was the first burial ground in the colonial period for people of African descent. So there are nearly 15,000 people who were buried in this land. And most likely this is where Bastian and Isabel were laid to rest and where their friends, if they had family members here, where they would have come to mourn the loss of Bastian and Isabel, to connect to their African traditions in a mourning ceremony. And the work of the African Burial Ground National Monument really was only possible because of community activism. This burial ground was unearthed in the 1990s in the construction for an office building, and through community protest and action, and the concern of people of African descent and others in New York and globally, it's because of this effort that we have a monument to be able to go visit, to connect to the impact that people of African descent made on New York before it was even New York. So definitely please go visit. And in the chat, you'll see their website now. So take a moment to look at how you can visit both virtually and in person to connect to these stories. And again, I mean, these are stories that were largely erased from our landscape and erased in many ways from our history books that I know growing up, I didn't learn that, there was slavery in New York or slavery in, colonial Dutch New Amsterdam. And it's really important that we understand that we can bring back the stories of people who were enslaved into our wider understanding of who shaped this city as it evolved. And so, we see here this plaque that says the changing landscape obscures the past. This is exactly what we see on the land where Bastian and Isabel's farm was today, if you were to visit that land now. Of course, you'd see the Tenement Museum right nearby, but on the land directly is this row house that was built in the 1830s by a man named George Sutton. And George Sutton, he, was a wealthy merchant who earned his wealth through shipping cotton from the South to Europe, particularly England. So he runs a shipping line that's shipping packets and particularly cotton on this route, and essentially earning his living from the work of people who were enslaved in the South. So this building that we see on the site of Bastian and Isabel's farm today, represents New York's reliance on, the work of enslaved laborers, whether those were people in the North or people in the South. New York's, place on the global stage as an economic powerhouse is only possible because of Black people and because of enslaved people of African descent. So, it's this building always, I think, invites me to then think again about what I think I know about a building or a landscape or a city to really try to go deeper. So our next story is going to take us to a little bit further in time to the 1860s during the Civil War, when we'll look at the story of a Black couple and family who were trying to navigate their place in the city. So our next story takes us a little further south as well, to what is modern day Chinatown, but in the 1860s would have been known as a neighborhood called Five Points, which probably many of you have also heard about and are familiar with. So the story here begins with these two people that we see in these portraits. This is Albro and Mary Lyons. We see them in these gold-framed portraits, dressed in sort of lavish outfits. And Albro and Mary Lyons, they are part of an educated Black elite in the mid-19th century. They're building wealth for themselves in the decades surrounding New York's emancipation. New York State emancipation was in 1827. Again, probably many of you are familiar, but we're the second latest state in the North to issue full emancipation to people who were enslaved. And Albro and Mary Lyons are part of the communities of people of African descent who are trying to navigate life for themselves in the decades, both in early America after the Revolution and then in the decades after New York State emancipation, trying to figure out, how they can establish themselves in the society of the United States. So Albert and Mary, they both were born and grew up in New York City. They get married in the 1840s. I wish we had a portrait of them at their wedding. I'm sure it would have been absolutely beautiful. And they are living and working in the Five Points neighborhood. This is where Albro, he owns a ship outfitting business at 42 Baxter Street in the neighborhood. And they live nearby at a home where they also are running a boarding house for Black sailors. So they are living in this Five Points community, actually after having been displaced from further north. And actually, I do just for a moment want to bring us back to that map that we were looking at of the city, just to help sort of situate us. So the Lions, they had moved from Lower Manhattan up to what is now Central Park, to an area called Seneca Village that maybe some of you are familiar with, sort of circling where Seneca Village would have been. This was a community of Black and African Americans and also others that's then, those people are displaced in the construction of Central Park. And so the Lyons family, they have to move back to their old neighborhood. And this is where Albert Lyons is then setting up his business. We see his business card here. He runs a general outfitting store for sailors and for the shipping industry. And, his job, is really to connect people to work that's available, to connect, ship captains to sailors to be employed on their ships. And he is perhaps serving white sailors as well as Black sailors, white ship captains. And this business really makes him a community establishment in many ways. You think about a place where you can go to find out about a job or to pick up your wages. This is also a place where people could have gone to ask Albro for advice on an issue they were having or on the latest debate within the neighborhood. And of course, 1863, where the story is centered, these debates are going to be about abolition and how within the communities of New York City, how are people fighting for national abolition of slavery? What's going on in the Civil War in this period? So his business is functioning as really a community hub. Albert was also an active member of the African Society for Mutual Relief. This was an aid organization in the neighborhood that was made up of artisans, craftsmen, real estate dealers, really prominent figures within the Black community of Five Points and the Black community more broadly. By this point, Black New Yorkers are living not only in Five Points, that was a historically Black neighborhood, but also are dispersed across parts of the city. These establishments are like Albert Lyons businesses where people are coming to hear the news, they're catching up with friends. The Lyons family, their community ties are also extending into activism. Their home where they run the boarding house for Black sailors is also part of the Underground Railroad. It's serving as a safe haven for self-emancipated people who are moving from the South, who had escaped enslavement. So, the Lions, their story and their home in particular, it helps us sort of illustrate the diversity of the Black community in this period, both economic diversity, ethnic diversity, and just time within New York City. There are new arrivals, and there are people like the Lions who have been here for generations. So let's look at sort of the neighborhood and get a sense of sort of how the Lions are moving within the world of 5 Points. So we'll come here to this image. And this actually is a drawing that was done in the 1860s, but it was meant to depict the neighborhood in 1827. So this is the year, again, of emancipation. It's a big year in New York City's history for the Black community. And in 1827, this neighborhood, it had the largest concentration of Black New Yorkers anywhere in the city, including, of course, working class Black New Yorkers and the educated Black elite, people like the Lyons family. So, I'd be curious, what are you noticing within this image? Sort of what messages are you seeing about the neighborhood from what is depicted in this drawing? So, I can just talk us through a little bit. We're looking at a couple of the streets. 5 Points is named for the 5 streets that came together into this central hub. We're seeing, a lot of buildings with grocery signs. This is sort of a euphemism for a place where you could buy liquor. We see a sort of water pump over on the side here. A lot of people gathered in the streets. I'd be curious, of course, what you're noticing, but something that always stands out to me is just how, we see the multiracial society of 5 Points, that while the neighborhood was predominantly African-American at this period, increasingly there are, Irish or German immigrants moving into the neighborhood, eventually Chinese immigrants moving in as well by the 1840s and 50s. We can start to get a sense of how the multiracial nature of the neighborhood and the way that people were living and working alongside each other across racial identities. It's this particular quality of the neighborhood that's leading to a lot of fear and really discriminatory perspectives among white middle-class New Yorkers. And so if you've heard of 5 Points, you might have a reference from, say, the movie The Gangs of New York, or of depictions of the neighborhood as really run down with difficult living conditions. And of course, those are truths of the experiences in 5 Points, that there were places, the buildings were much older and therefore were more run down, that, it was often difficult to keep a family healthy in 5 Points. But what the white press and what we see, in this image too, it's often, glossing over or ignoring the richness of the Black communities within 5 Points. And so, Albert Lyons, when he leaves his, business every day, when he's walking home, he, is going to pass by maybe Pete Almec's cellar. This is a Black-owned establishment that had both white and Black clientele, where you could listen to music, you could dance, you could, just take a break from your work day. Albert Lyons might not have been going there because it was more of a working class establishment, but he's probably hearing music coming from a place like Pete Almec's. He could pick up a copy of the weekly Anglo-African newspaper to read about, the latest news. And, we really see that this neighborhood, it's containing these connections and complications of, Black communities and newly arriving European immigrants living side by side. And that, there are connections like, families that are formed between Irish immigrants and Black New Yorkers. And, of course, many instances of people socializing or working together across, racial divides. We also see increased antagonism and competition on the part of, white immigrants as, Black working class people in the neighborhood and white immigrants are competing for similar jobs. So, Five Points contains, really these tensions, as well as community. And, this is the dynamic into which, the tensions of the Civil War are being placed. And it's in this mix that the Lyons family, their business, it stood as a real symbol of Black success and of the Black community in the neighborhood. And the Lyons family, they are attacked in 1863 in the summer as part of a much larger wave of white violence against Black communities in New York City. So here we see depicted the street where the Lyons family lives. We think this one of these taller brick buildings would have been one of their houses. This is from descriptions from their daughter in one of her memoirs. They lived in a tall brick building. And this building in July of 1863 was, violently attacked by a mob of Irish and German immigrants, some native-born New Yorkers, as part of what is often referred to as the draft riots. This was essentially a week of violence that was sparked by white working class New Yorkers sort of voicing their displeasure over a draft where, if you had $200, you could buy your way out of the draft. African Americans were not drafted at this point because they were not citizens. This what begins as a protest against the draft and an attack on white institutions and businesses, this quickly evolves into, a white mob moving through the city, directing violence, particularly at Black communities and businesses, and white residents as well who support Black communities find themselves attacked. So this is history that's often represented as a violence over the draft, but we see it could be better understood as a race riot. Many Black people in the city were murdered in this week of violence, and likely many more people were murdered than were reported in this week. And the Lyons family, they were not physically attacked. They were able to escape their home, but we think of just the psychological violence that they would experience. That in their home, their daughter wrote of this attack, that their interior was dismantled, that furniture went missing, was broken, and from the basement to the attic, there was evidence of the worst vandalism. And we see that. This event really offers us the opportunity to rethink how we frame this week of violence and how we can better understand the tensions and the anti-Black racism that is fueling the violence that we see in this week. And a way to also understand that the Black communities are really deeply impacted in their sense of home in New York after this violence. That, the Lyons daughter, she writes of these experiences and her family's attack. I mean, here she is as a young girl. She was 15 when, her family's home was attacked. And she wrote, that her family fled the city. After this, they were able to escape, and in particular, she wrote about how this changed her parents' idea of the city. So I'll just read a quote from her memoir that can give us an understanding of this. She said, "Under the cover of darkness, the police conveyed our parents to the Williamsburg Ferry. There, steamboats were kept in readiness to either transport fugitives or to outwit rioters by pulling out into midstream. To such humiliations, to such outrages, were law-abiding citizens exposed, and that in a city where they were domiciled taxpayers. Is it any wonder that for them, New York was never after to be considered home?" And so, we hear this experience from the Lyons family through Maritcha Lyons's memoirs, and Um, in the records from the police department in the period, we can see that Black New Yorkers who were attacked, they're left homeless in many cases, because their houses are destroyed. Many of them try to collect reparations. Albert Lyons actually stays in the city. He doesn't leave with his family to try to collect damages for the property that was destroyed. And we see how the Black community in New York is trying to figure out then, do they stay or do they leave? And many Black New Yorkers decide to leave. New York City loses about roughly 6,000 of its Black residents in this period, of about, by some estimates, about 16,000 Black residents before the draft riots. Again, this is possible that this is an undercount of the population. Maybe there's many more Black residents in the city at this period, but there's a large population of Black residents who move away after the draft riots. And the Lyons family, they eventually settle in Providence, Rhode Island. But some Black New Yorkers do decide to stay or are unable to move away. Perhaps they don't have the finances to move. So the museum, actually, I mentioned at the beginning that we're going to be telling the story of an African-American couple in the 1860s. This is the person whose story we're going to be telling. Here we see Joseph Moore. He's listed as a waiter at 17 Lawrence Street. He's listed with a racial designation of colored. Here, he's directly above a person whose story we've been telling for many years at the Tenement Museum, an Irish immigrant named Joseph Moore, who lives at 97 Orchard Street. These two Joseph Moores, they have the same job. They live in different parts of the city. Lawrence Street is northwest of Five Points. And Joseph Moore decides to stay in the city after the draft riots. He lives here through this time period. And we're going to be exploring his story alongside the story of the Irish Joseph Moore to really understand, just what were the relationships between Black Americans and Irish Americans in this period, and how can we better understand ideas about, what it means to be American, and how can we understand better conversations that we're having today about the United States by looking at these two stories together. And so stay tuned for more on that project, and it will really allow us to expand the stories that we tell in our historic buildings. So the story for the Lyons actually does conclude with Maricha moving back in 1869. She moves back to the city and eventually moves to Brooklyn. She becomes a teacher and really carries forward her parents' activism, seeing their inspirations of, running a boarding house that's part of the Underground Railroad. She continues to fight for, the rights of Black communities in New York and nationally, works alongside other Black women activists in the late 19th century. She even founds a settlement house for Black women who are arriving from the South and from the Caribbean in the second half of the 19th century. So she really dedicates her life to carrying forward the work of her parents, working not just for themselves, but for others. And that really brings us to our next story, looking at how someone is working for future generations. Please, if you have any questions, I'd love to hear those. Definitely anything that you're connecting to or that you're curious about, put that into the chat. So our next story, we are moving a little bit further in time to the 1920s and a little bit further north to the area that we still refer to today as Little Italy, and in the 1920s was definitely Little Italy. But this story is centered on this building. This is Engine 55. So it's a firehouse on Broome Street. And the story of Wesley Williams as the first Black firefighter in this firehouse and the third Black firefighter in the whole fire department for New York City. So here, let me show you Wesley Williams and some of the members of his family. So Wesley Williams is the one on the right in this image. He's standing next to his grandfather and then his father. And in front of him is his son. So we see 4 generations of the Williams men in this portrait. Wesley Williams, he's born in Harlem in 1897. Even by the 1890s, we can see that sort of the Black communities had been pushed and sort of displaced further north in the city, along the west side, eventually to Harlem. So by the 1890s, Harlem was really beginning to, take what would be its place on the global stage as, the center of Black life in New York. So Wesley Williams was born in Harlem, 1897, to James and Lucy Williams. His grandfather, who we see here in the center, he self-emancipated himself, freed himself, escaped from slavery in Virginia, and moved up to New York. And his grandfather, migrated from the South, but Wesley Williams' story, it actually takes place against this backdrop of increased Black migration in this period of the first half of the 20th century. So in this period, there are more Black immigrants from the Caribbean moving to New York, but also we see the beginnings of the Great Migration. This really begins after World War II, where thousands of African Americans are moving from the South to New York City, fleeing the racial violence in southern states. So this is a period where there are many, many, many more Black, people, both immigrants, migrants, settling in New York City, and finding that, while there is not sort of legal segregation in New York, they're still finding a lot of limitations and lack of access to jobs. And Wesley Williams, he's growing up in this evolving Black community in Harlem, trying to find where he can get stable employment. It's in civil service that he finds some of this stability that wouldn't have been found as much in other industries, like, for example, working in the service industry or in garment work for Black women. There's a lot of lack of access and racism that are blocking Black New Yorkers from those jobs, but civil service does provide an avenue in. So we see Wesley Williams, he decides to, sign up to take the exams to become a firefighter. And that's not that photo. Sorry, we'll come to that in a moment. Here we go. He is here pictured with his probationary class of fellow firefighters. This is in April of 1919. And to get into this photo, he would have had to take a written exam and a physical exam. And for the written exam, there was a test prep course where you could, get study assistance. This test prep course was only open to white applicants. So Wesley Williams would have to study on his own for this test. And he does very well on both exams. The physical exam, he in fact places first. He was always very dedicated to physical fitness and regularly would exercise at the Harlem YMCA. This exam is just one sort of example of how there was this sort of often unspoken culture of racism that Black New Yorkers were facing in the city, and how Wesley, in entering the fire department, would have to overcome these hurdles that were placed in his way. And he gets some help from his dad in sort of surmounting these barriers. He would need some letters of recommendation to enter the fire department. So we see again here, his father would help him get these letters because of his father's position. His father was the head of the Red Caps, who were the porters at Grand Central, who would help people who were traveling on the train lines. So his father has a very prestigious position for a Black New Yorker, and really for a New Yorker overall. And it's through Wesley's own dedication and through his father's assistance that he's able to enter the fire department. So he enters in April of 1919, and we see a few images of him here. Here he is alone, sitting on a fire engine. He eventually learns to drive a fire engine, which would have been a particular skill within the firehouse. Here he is pictured with some of his coworkers. On the day that Wesley arrives for duty, he would have been assigned to this firehouse in Little Italy. He didn't select this particular firehouse. So in integrating this firehouse, it wasn't necessarily his choice. On the day that he arrives for duty, every single other firefighter threatens to quit and asks for a transfer. And the head of this firehouse actually does retire rather than lead a firehouse that was integrated. So Wesley Williams faces, both structural and personal acts of racism directed towards him, that his white coworkers refused to eat with him, wouldn't sleep in the same area where he slept. There was one particular act where they left him in a burning building to fight a fire by himself. And he experiences sort of the weight of, I just think too of how, what were his coworkers learning about people of African descent that made them feel like it was okay to do these things and to act in this way towards their coworker. Sort of what's in the media at the time, what messages are they taking in? And Wesley, he spends a lot of time alone then, and decides to really excel in his work. He studies for tests to advance in the fire department. He spends time exercising, learning how to, for example, drive a fire engine, sort of taking on more skills as he develops in his career. He eventually becomes, through his dedication and through his study, he becomes the first ever Black lieutenant in the FDNY. This is in 1927. And this is a monumental first for Wesley Williams. And thinking about just how lonely it might have been for him in being this first, in trying to figure out how to navigate day-to-day life in the firehouse. And it's in this time, he's also forming bonds with other Black firefighters as there are more, Black firefighters being hired by the FDNY. And he, eventually has the idea that Black firefighters, as they are dispersed in firehouses across the city, would be stronger together than trying to advocate individually for improvement in their careers. So Wesley Williams, together with a few other Black firefighters, in the year 1941, founds an organization called the Vulcan Society. Here we see a photo, which you got a sneak peek of the Vulcan Society's 20th anniversary in 1960. Oh, it's almost the date, May 27th, where they celebrated this. So this was at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. And this was, after then 2 decades of the Vulcan Society being established as a fraternal support organization for Black firefighters. Through this community, they would help each other advance in their careers and resolve issues within their particular engine companies, and really seeing the power in the collective in coming together to fight against the barriers that they faced. And so unfortunately, Wesley Williams is not in this image. I'm sorry, I should have been calling him Chief Williams. Chief Williams is not pictured in this image, but we see, some of his cohort who were really these path breakers in integrating firehouses and working together to have really communal action to improve their experiences and the experiences of future Black firefighters. Today, the Vulcan Society is still really an active national and even international society. So Chief Williams's legacy is felt across the globe. And, it was actually only just a few years ago in 2007 that the Vulcan Society still they had to bring a court case to the city over discriminatory testing and hiring practices within the fire department. So we still see, there's a need within the civil service agencies in the city for an organization like the Vulcan Society to advocate for themselves. And, we hear some of the story from the Vulcan Society members who commemorate Chief Williams' legacy. We also hear some of these stories from, Chief Williams's grandson, Charles Williams, who knew his grandfather really well, wrote a book, in fact, about his grandfather's life. And so, I even think back to Maritza Lyons writing a memoir about her experiences. Just seeing how are people documenting their own stories and the stories of their families for future generations. And, today there's a block of 135th Street that's named after Chief Williams, but currently there's no marker on Engine 55 to acknowledge Wesley Williams, Chief Williams' legacy in Little Italy. So perhaps, through continued advocacy, we can help secure a physical marker to his legacy in this firehouse. But, we can really also see Chief Williams' story as foreshadowing the later civil rights movement in the United States and in New York City. That Chief Williams' story is really an ancestor of these 20th century efforts to work for Black freedom in New York. So that's where we'll go next. To look at a story of what we still sort of see as the traditional civil rights movement in the 1960s. So this story takes place, again, very close to where the Tenement Museum is located. And this is a story of a activist organization in the 1960s who set up a headquarters at 6040-66 Delancey Street. So this building here was home to the headquarters of the downtown chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality from 1963 to 1966. And it's a relatively nondescript 4-story brick building where the organizing for the downtown core chapter would have taken place. And so this story, it's situated in sort of this really important period within the wider civil rights movement, and gives us a chance to kind of relocate where we think of with the civil rights movement, and looking at how the Congress of Racial Equality, it was established in the North. In 1942, CORE was established in Chicago. Specifically to work against the racism within northern cities. And this is a pamphlet, a CORE training pamphlet from 1963. We see a drawing of Mahatma Gandhi, sort of echoing the nonviolent direct action that the Congress of Racial Equality becomes known for. And here is a description of one of the techniques of CORE, the sit-in. So probably many of you, of course, are familiar with this strategy for direct action that was used to integrate, parts of society across the United States. And here it says that the sit-in is CORE's oldest and most widely used technique. And it really highlights the direct nature of CORE's work, that you're physically using your bodies for justice and action. And it highlights the interracial dynamic of CORE, that there were both Black and white members of the Congress of Racial Equality. So this is a training pamphlet that people in downtown CORE might have used in their work. So we can understand, right, that the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century, it takes place in the North as well as in the South, where it's more commonly sort of understood within US history, but also within New York. by the 1960s, there's really 2 decades of civil rights action within the city. Really following World War II is when we see this increase in Black New Yorkers fighting to open up society to them. So here we see a sit-in from members of CORE. This was at City Hall, and this was actually organized by the Harlem chapter of CORE, not the downtown chapter, but they often work together. So the downtown chapter's members would know about this action, and here they're protesting the discrimination within the construction industry. We see 7 people sitting on the floor of City Hall. We see 3 signs written, and the one that's most visible says, "We are waiting for equality in the building trades." And, we see here there's 4 Black people, 3 white, but everyone's young. So we can really start to understand that the members of Downtown Core, they are young people in their late teens, early 20s, many, many college students. And I really just think, it's so important to understand the legacy of young people fighting for justice in the US, as we see today, the fight for racial justice really in many ways being led by both young people and people who have been fighting these fights for generations. So these young people are really taking on work that had been part of New York City's society for, again, 2 decades in trying to open up jobs and housing and education opportunities for Black New Yorkers, for people of color more broadly. And, CORE, in setting up in the Lower East Side in the 1960s, they really would have wanted to focus on local issues, that this was the need. They opened this chapter of CORE particularly to see what needs addressing within the Lower East Side. And to understand what needed addressing, we can look briefly at a photo of the neighborhood in this period. So this is of the mid-1960s. This was taken on Delancey and Orchard, so directly across the street from where the Tenement Museum's building at 103 Orchard Street stands. And, we can get a sense of just how the neighborhood has changed demographically at this period. The neighborhood becomes much more racially diverse by the 1960s, again, because of the Great Migration, with African Americans leaving the South for cities like New York and moving into neighborhoods like the Lower East Side. But also it's becoming more diverse through migration from Puerto Rico. Many Puerto Ricans moving into the neighborhood as well are Afro-Latino, right, and are also people of African descent. There are also, more immigrants moving into the neighborhood at this period from places like the Dominican Republic, China. So the neighborhood is becoming much more diverse. And there are really limited housing options for Black Lower East Siders and Puerto Rican Lower East Siders, that they're finding that they're squeezed into older tenement buildings, into more rundown housing, that they're charged higher rent, that there are fewer options for housing. So it's really housing that Downtown Core takes up as their major issue to fight against and to work with in the city, to try to open up more apartments in the Lower East Side and to reveal discrimination that was happening in rental practices by landlords across the neighborhood. So, we see that Downtown Core, they start a number of initiatives to focus on housing in the Lower East Side. And, in particular, one that was started in the spring of 1964 was called Operation East Side. And here we see a New York Times article about that initiative. It says that Core is going to fight poverty on the Lower East Side, that workers will go into the neighborhood to survey the needs and give assistance. We see William Sprowell, chapter chairman, is leading this press conference where they're describing this action. And that action will include the establishment of housing and welfare clinics, and if necessary, sit-ins and civil disobedience would be included. So we can get a sense that the members of Downtown Core, these young people, are looking to understand from their neighbors and from people who live in the Lower East Side, what are the issues they're facing, particularly as Black or Puerto Rican Lower East Siders, and that the members of Downtown Core are trying different strategies and really implementing a wide range of tactics to both fight poverty in the Lower East Side and open up housing. And just to note as well that by 1964, New York City had a law prohibiting discrimination by racial identity in private rentals. So there was already legislation on the books, but we really see it was in the enforcement that discrimination is still happening. There was not good enforcement and it was not regular. So that's one of CORE's other efforts, is to really try to hold the city accountable to its legislation, and helps us understand that within the civil rights movement, it's not just about legislation, right? That legislation often doesn't lead to the kind of change that people are working towards. So there are, these broad goals that people within Downtown Core are hoping for and putting their effort towards. And we can imagine then this building where these meetings are happening to plan Operation East Side and their other initiatives, that people they're not gonna all agree on, what strategies they should use, or whether they are going to stand their ground if they are attacked. Are they going to stick to their nonviolent sort of philosophy within CORE? These are questions that, of course, civil rights activists across the country are facing and are having to sort of question for themselves. And of course, questions that then members of Downtown Core are asking of themselves. And it's these questions that, particularly when civil rights actions were faced by so much, opposition and violence, both in New York City and in the South. It's these questions that start to lead, particularly Black members of organizations like CORE, to try to think of something different, and to see that maybe there are more possibilities for themselves in achieving, liberation through other strategies, and maybe not through interracial action. So, we see that by 1966, Downtown Core has ended in as it having its headquarters in this building. And they lose about 75% of their membership, particularly Black members of CORE and of Downtown Core are leaving to join organizations that are connected to the Black Power movement and connected to sort of Black liberation driven for and by people of African descent. And so, 1966, of course, is also, this turning point for the civil rights movement overall, where we see the rise of Black nationalism and really this work for independence and a global community across the African diaspora to work for, liberation efforts. And so our last stop is going to take us to explore sort of the cultural expression of some of these ideas of Black liberation within the neighborhood that are connected to the Black arts movement in this period just after Downtown Core closes. So this will be our last story, and I'm seeing a question just from Giovanna of just how does the awareness of the history of African Americans that was erased from the museum's history change the vision and outreach to the community and employees of the museum? So that's a really, really good question, right? Of thinking about how, because the museum hasn't included stories of Black and African American experience for many, many years, how is the work ahead for us really working with people in the neighborhood? Even the idea for this tour really generated from our staff, really asking for the museum to develop a tour and to really address more fully Black and African American presence in the neighborhood. So this is really the the legacy on which we are developing this tour is, keeping in mind what our staff have advocated for many years, and questioning, our own legacy as a museum, right? Where are the things that we need to think about from our own past, and how can we, be reflecting on our own history as a museum to be telling fuller stories, and to be acknowledging that this is the first time in 20 years that the museum has addressed Black history. So that's a really good, really, really important question. And I think also a question that so many museums across the country are sort of asking themselves, as well as how do you expand stories with, communities and with, your staff. And second question too is, will the museum research any of the other communities that lived during this time? So that's also a good question. Perhaps, who knows what the future will hold after we sort of work on this research for Joseph and Rachel Moore and telling their story from the 1860s. There are other pockets of the Lower East Side community in different time periods, and particularly the 20th century, that we could really look to research next. So good question. Stay tuned as our stories continue to evolve all the time. So I want to close us out with a story of Studio We. And Studio We was a jazz performance and practice space that was set up on Eldred Street, just north of where the Tenement Museum is, in the 1970s. And the story of Studio We really, it draws on the story of downtown core, and that we see these efforts for housing in the neighborhood at the time. That the period of the middle of the 20th century is one of extreme disinvestment in the Lower East Side, and many buildings are abandoned and left empty by the landlords in the late 1960s, 1970s. And Studio We, it begins in an abandoned tenement building. So here, we see two images. On the left is 193 Eldred Street, where Studio We began. And on the right is a photograph of East 5th Street, a little bit north in the neighborhood, just showing some of the impact of the disinvestment of empty lots where buildings had been demolished, and evidence of buildings that are not being lived in. So this building at 193 Eldred Street had been abandoned by the landlord, and there was a caretaker and musician, Burton Green, who was essentially minding the property on behalf of the landlord. In the late 1960s, Burton Green decided to move to Europe, and his friend James Du Bois learned that Burton Green was moving, and asks Green if he can move in. And he had a particular idea in mind already of how to use this space. He wanted to create a performance space, particularly for Black musicians, to really have a space that could be for and by Black musicians. So we see James Du Bois in this photograph of Studio We musicians outside of the building. So you can get a sense. Across the top, it says Studio We, a community music project. And James Du Bois is the sixth from the right in this photograph. He upon moving into this building, immediately starts sort of recruiting some of his friends, playing performances in this building where, the ceiling and ceilings on different floors were caving in, the roof needed repairs, there was no plumbing. So they start playing in these spaces, holding impromptu performances, charging a little bit of money to begin to raise funds to do repairs on the building. And they were very intentional about organizing within Studio We. That James Du Bois is the head of an organization for Black musicians called the Society for Universal Culture and Arts. And he and many of his fellow musicians, they bring sort of this organizing expertise to this ethos of setting up Studio We. that they eventually transform the building into a home for themselves and into practice and performance spaces. So they have a stage up on the 6th floor. They have studios on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors. Du Bois also recruits his brother to set up a soul food restaurant in the lower level. So this building is really, reclaimed. If we come back to sort of the word from the title of this tour, it's reclaimed from abandonment by James Du Bois and other musicians like Juma Sultan, Noah Howard, Frank Lowe, people that we see in this photograph. And their vision is one of financial independence for themselves, of also being able to do something different. This is a period where jazz was not as popular as it had been in the first part of the 20th century. Of course, this is a music rooted in African American culture. So this was a moment for these musicians to take sort of the form of jazz and do something different. And in doing something different with their music, also do something different with the structure of their performance space, that everyone was welcome at performances here. We can see evidence of this in a flyer from a festival held at Studio We over the 4th of July in 1970. The festival was called 3 Days of Peace Between the Ears. And we see, there's 9 different bands playing at this festival, that it lists Sunday afternoon performances at 2 p.m. It's free to children. And, we can get a sense this is a hand-drawn flyer. We have the really kind of grassroots, do-it-yourself nature of the performances and the promotional materials for these performances. And this of course, the practices of the music and in setting up festivals that are so welcoming and open, this was really part of the political outlook that many of these musicians were carrying with them. They are playing at a time where there is really an emerging movement of Black artists across New York City, across the United States, globally, who are working to create, art by and for people of African descent, really connecting to the, the politics of the Black Power movement and of sort of self-determination for themselves. And so this sort of do-it-yourself flyer that we see has this wider political context, of course, as Black musicians at Studio We are connecting to Black musicians in Harlem, Black artists throughout the Lower East Side, and actually the Lower East Side really has sort of a pocket of the Black arts movement within the wider city. So, the neighborhood isn't as often associated with the Black arts movement. We tend to associate it with Harlem, but we see poets and writers and, theater artists, musicians, connecting across New York neighborhoods, connecting to, of course, then justice movements in the South and globally. And there was a writer, her name was Sarah Wright, and the way she described sort of this period for Black artists in the Lower East Side was that we managed to make a Harlem Renaissance downtown, reverberating to the rising struggles of the civil rights and Black liberation movements around the country. And I wanted to close with some music, because this, of course, would not be complete without some music. And I'll play just a few minutes of a solo performance by Frank Lowe. He is the 3rd from the left in this photo. And this was not recorded at Studio We. Unfortunately, there are very few recordings from this period in Studio We, but this was in a similar sort of club. These clubs, I should say, to places like Studio We, there are many of them, and throughout downtown Manhattan, and they sort of become associated with this idea called loft jazz, even though that wasn't really a genre. It's really more associated with these abandoned spaces that were being sort of revived by artists. So this music that I'll play will give you a sense of how, this idea of loft jazz, it isn't easily definable, and it had all different types of expressions from different musicians. So we'll hear Frank Lowe for about 2 minutes, and then we'll close out our evening. So I encourage you all to look up Frank Lowe, to listen to the whole piece. It's called Solo Movement B. And I hope that put you in a sort of slightly different place, taking you to one of these spaces to hear, Frank Lowe, Juma Sultan, James Du Bois play. And, I just keep coming back to this idea that these musicians were really hoping to do something different with their music and with their space, that was different from, what they'd seen before. And I see that as a way that we can carry these stories through to our present day, in looking at how Black communities have formed and nurtured themselves throughout the history of Lower Manhattan. And how we are, of course, still in a place in our country where this kind of attention to Black communities and the work of racial justice is still ahead. And part of that work is understanding what histories we have to relearn, what histories of our own experiences we should document for future generations. And this, of course, always is part of the work of the Tenement Museum, of looking at how we all have a role in documenting history for the future. So thank you all so much for joining for this journey, looking at these stories of communities in different time periods, and understanding how the Tenement Museum is working to expand the stories that we tell. So this tour will open in person in June, so come visit us to visit these sites physically if you are in the city. If not, please stay connected to us to hear more of our research for our upcoming new building tour about Rachel and Joseph Moore. And we hope that you will stay connected to the museum, and that we'll see you again soon. So good night, everyone, and take care.